January 2013, the airport at Yangon, Myanmar. Beneath the concrete and the packed red earth, a ground-penetrating radar system is moving slowly across the tarmac, its operator watching a screen filled with ghostly shapes, long, rectangular outlines, rows of them. The technician stops, looks again. The shapes are the right size. They are the right depth. And according to a Lincolnshire farmer named David Cundall, who has spent 16 years of his life and 130,000 pounds of his own money to reach this moment, they are exactly where they should be. 60 brand new Spitfires, still in their packing crates, buried by the Royal Air Force at the end of the Second World War. Never unpacked, never flown. Sealed in waxed paper and grease, waiting underground for nearly 70 years. What happens next will involve the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the President of Myanmar, an international press corps, and a fleet of excavators ripping through the surface of an active international airport. And at the end of all of it, there will be no Spitfires. But the story of how the world came to believe they were there, and why a single farmer gave 2 decades of his life to find them, is one of the most extraordinary tales of obsession, memory, and wishful history ever attached to a piece of steel. This is recovered steel. To understand why anyone would spend 20 years searching for a buried Spitfire, you first have to understand what a Spitfire is. Not the statistics, though, those matter. Not the kill ratios from the Battle of Britain, though those are staggering. What the Spitfire represents. It is the aircraft that, more than any other machine in the British arsenal, came to stand for the idea that elegance and ferocity could live in the same body. Narrow fuselage, elliptical wing, Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, designed by a man who was already dying when he finished it, and who would never see what it did to the sky above England in the summer of 1940. Mitchell died in June 1937. He was 42 years old. His aircraft flew its first combat sortie 2 years later, and went on to serve in every major theater of the war. More than 22,000 Spitfires were built across 24 variants. By 1945, the Spitfire had become something beyond a weapon. It had become a relic, the kind of machine that inspires legends. August 1945, a consignment of Spitfire. Mark 14s with Griffin engines arrived by ship at the port of Rangoon. Japan had already surrendered, the pilots were going home, and in the chaos and exhaustion of demobilization, someone somewhere made a decision about those crates. What that decision actually was, the records would later show with some clarity. But the records were in London, and in the absence of documentation, something older and more persistent took hold. A story. Not malicious, not invented by any one person, but passed from mouth to ear to mouth, through decades of veterans' reunions and aviation magazines, and conversations at air shows, until by the early 1990s, it had acquired the weight of certainty. The Spitfires of Burma were out there, underground, waiting. What we are going to follow across the next hour and a half is the full arc of one of those legends. The story begins in a hotel in Florida, where 2 American veterans tell an improbable story at a party. It crosses 2 decades of obsession, 2 governments, and 2 continents. It ends in a hole in the ground at an international airport, with nothing inside. But what the searchers found instead, buried in the gap between the story and the evidence, is something that may matter more than any aircraft. It is the anatomy of a myth. Stay with us. We begin not in Burma. We begin in the air, in the shape of a wing. The shape of a wing is not decoration. The shape of a wing is everything. Reginald Joseph Mitchell was not a romantic. He was an engineer from Stoke-on-Trent who had spent the 1920s designing racing seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy, pushing propellers and fuselages to the edge of what metal and aerodynamics would allow. He won the trophy 3 times. And in doing so, he learned something about speed that most aircraft designers of his generation had not yet understood. The shape of a wing is not decoration. The shape of a wing is everything. When the Air Ministry contracted him in December 1934 to design a new high-performance interceptor, Mitchell did not start from convention. He started from physics. The result was a wing unlike anything flying at the time, a thin elliptical planform, the cross-section so narrow that standard machine gun mounts could not fit inside without custom engineering. His colleague Beverly Shenstone had suggested the elliptical shape for its aerodynamic efficiency. Mitchell kept it, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because the numbers demanded it. The ellipse minimized induced drag at high speed. In a dogfight, that margin was everything. The prototype, designated K5054, lifted off from Eastleigh Aerodrome on the 5th of March, 1936. The test pilot, Joseph Mutt Summers, landed and reportedly said, "Do not touch anything." He meant it as a compliment. The aircraft flew exactly as designed on the first attempt. Mitchell, watching from the airfield, is said to have allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had perhaps 14 months to live. By the time the first production aircraft reached operational squadrons in August 1938, Mitchell was already dead. He had been diagnosed with cancer in 1933, undergone surgery, returned to work, and refused to slow down. He drove himself through the final years of the aircraft's development, with a kind of urgency that his colleagues recognized only in retrospect. His successor as chief designer, Joseph Smith, would take the aircraft through 23 further variants. But the fundamental architecture, the ellipse, the thin fuselage, the nose that tapered to a point, was Mitchell's. What makes this relevant to our story is not sentiment, it is scale. By August 1945, when a consignment of Spitfire Mark 14s arrived by ship at the port of Rangoon, those aircraft were the product of 11 years of refinement from Mitchell's first sketch. They were fitted with the Rolls-Royce Griffin engine, a development of the Merlin capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. Their top speed approached 450 miles per hour. They were, by any measure, among the finest piston engine fighters ever built. And according to the legend we are tracing, all of them were put back in their crates and buried in the earth of Burma without a single one ever being flown. Southeast Asia in 1945 was a different war to the one fought over England in 1940. The Burma campaign was fought in monsoon jungle, across mountain ranges and river systems that made European logistics look simple. The RAF had operated from Rangoon and from forward airstrips carved out of the jungle, using a succession of aircraft types as the Allied position, shifted from near collapse in 1942 to hard-won advance by 1944. Mingaladon, the main RAF airfield outside Rangoon, had been held by the Japanese since 1942. British and Commonwealth forces retook it in May 1945, just weeks before the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of that year. The Japanese surrender came swiftly, and with it came a logistical crisis that nobody had planned for. What do you do with the equipment already in transit? The crates had left England before the surrender. The ships carrying them were already in Asian waters when the signal came that the war was over. The Mark 14s aboard those vessels, intended to reinforce squadrons that no longer needed reinforcing, arrived into a world that no longer needed them. Japan had surrendered. The pilots were going home. And in the chaos of demobilization, someone somewhere made a decision about those crates. The story has a beginning, though like all good myths, it conceals it. The starting point that researchers have been able to trace runs back to a party sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s in Jacksonville, Florida. An aviation archaeologist named Jim Pierce was at the party when two American veterans approached him. The veterans said they had been in Burma at the end of the war, and they said that during the chaos of demobilization, they had been assigned a task that struck them as extraordinary, burying crated aircraft in the earth near the airstrip, not scrapping them, not flying them out, burying them. New planes, still in their packing, pushed into trenches by bulldozers and covered over with dirt. Pierce was skeptical, but he was also intrigued. He was in the business of finding things that history had misplaced. He filed the story away, and at some point, he mentioned it to a friend, a farmer from Lincolnshire who shared his passion for lost aircraft. That farmer's name was David Cundall, and unlike Pierce, Cundall did not file it away. He turned it into a project, then into an obsession, then into the defining enterprise of 20 years of his life. The power of the veteran's testimony should not be underestimated, nor should it be dismissed. The men were speaking of events that had happened 3 or 4 decades earlier, in a state of exhaustion and upheaval that those who have not experienced military demobilization find difficult to imagine. Units were being disbanded, records were not being kept with peacetime precision, and men were doing whatever their officers told them, without necessarily understanding why or writing it down. The testimony of veterans who said they buried aircraft is not evidence of a lie. It may be evidence of something more interesting, of memory's tendency to assemble coherent stories from fragments of real experience, filling gaps with what makes sense rather than with what happened. But in the early 1990s, when David Kundal first began his pursuit, none of that analysis had been done. There were men who said they had buried Spitfires, there was a location, and there was David Kundal. Legends do not spread by lying. They spread by being passed between people who genuinely believe them. And the story of the Burma Spitfires had qualities that made it almost perfectly suited to travel through the networks of aviation enthusiasts, veterans associations, and wartime history communities. First, it was specific. The aircraft were named, not generic. Spitfires, not just planes. And not just any Spitfire, but new ones, crated, preserved in waxed paper and grease against the tropical humidity. The specificity gave the story credibility. Vague legends fade. Specific ones accumulate detail. Second, it was emotional. The Spitfire, by the early 1990s, had become the most potent symbol of British wartime identity. The idea that dozens of them might be underground, intact, flyable with the right restoration work, tapped into a nostalgia so powerful that it overwhelmed critical scrutiny. People wanted this to be true, and when people want something to be true, they become selective about the evidence they weigh. Third, it had witnesses. David Kundal placed advertisements in aviation magazines asking for veterans with information about the Burma airfields. He received responses. Some of the men who came forward were specific, some were vague. Some had heard the story from someone else and believed it to be first-hand experience. Memory contamination, the process by which a story we have heard becomes, over time, a memory we believe we have lived, is one of the best documented phenomena in cognitive psychology. In the 1990s, it was less understood. Kundal was not a psychologist. He was a farmer with a mission. By the mid-1990s, he had a file of testimonies, a conviction, and the beginning of a plan. What he needed next was access, and Burma, in the 90s, was not a country that granted access easily. David Kundal was not, by any conventional measure, the kind of man who ends up negotiating with prime ministers. He was a farmer. He worked the land in Lincolnshire, a county whose flat horizons and wide skies had been home to more RAF airfields during the Second World War than almost anywhere else in Britain. He was a man for whom the war was not distant history, but something present in the landscape, in the concrete foundations still visible at the edges of fields, in the occasional piece of aircraft wreckage that turned up when a plow went deep. His interest in lost aircraft was not unusual in that context. Aviation archaeology, the methodical search for crashed or missing wartime aircraft, had become a serious hobby community in Britain by the 1980s, with recognized practitioners, publications, and occasionally government sanction. What was unusual was the scale of what Kundal proposed to find. Not a single crashed fighter, but an entire consignment of brand new machines, buried intact. The story that Jim Pierce had passed to him was remarkable. And Kundal, as people who knew him would later attest, was a man who did not do things in moderation. When he decided something was worth pursuing, he pursued it. He made his first trip to Burma in the mid-1990s. The country was under military junta government. International relations were difficult, and access to airfields required navigating bureaucracies that operated on their own opaque logic. None of this deterred him. He came back. He went again. He made a dozen visits over 15 years, building contacts, gathering more testimonies, commissioning preliminary surveys. He spent money that, by any reasonable accounting, was disproportionate to the probability of success. But the probability was not what Kundal was calculating. He was calculating the possibility, and the possibility, according to everyone who had given him a statement, was real. By the early 2000s, David Kundal had assembled what seemed, to those who examined it without extensive historical training, like a compelling case. He had multiple testimonies from men who claimed involvement in or knowledge of the burial. He had a location, the area around Mingaladon Airfield, now the International Airport of Yangon, and he had begun to gather scientific support. In 2004, Dr. Adam Booth, a geophysicist then at the University of Leeds, became involved in the project. Booth had expertise in ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic prospection, the same tools used by archaeologists to detect buried structures without excavating. Over successive visits, Booth and his colleagues ran surveys across portions of the airfield area. The radar returned anomalies, features at the right depth, with shapes that could be consistent with buried rectangular crates. This is the point at which the scientific evidence was simultaneously most compelling and most ambiguous. Ground-penetrating radar is an excellent tool for detecting buried anomalies. It is a poor tool for identifying what those anomalies are. The radar could say there is something here at this depth with this shape. It could not say whether that something was a crate containing a Spitfire, a section of collapsed drainage, or a layer of wartime construction material. The distinction required excavation. A man named Andrew Johnson came forward with a family story. His grandfather, a flight sergeant in RAF No. 96 Squadron, had served in the Burma campaign and believed he had helped to bury the Spitfires. Johnson said he could practically guarantee the location. Kundal listened, he always listened, and he filed each new testimony alongside the others, building a case file that, by 2010, was substantial enough to take to government. He had the surveys, he had the testimonies, and in 2012 he had something even more powerful, a moment of political coincidence that would take his private obsession onto the front pages of the world's newspapers. For anyone who wants to understand the depth of David Kundal's commitment, it is necessary to understand what Burma was in the 1990s. The country was ruled by a military junta that had seized power in 1988, suppressed a pro-democracy uprising with lethal force, and placed the democracy movement's figurehead under house arrest. International sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the regime's deep suspicion of foreign contacts made it one of the most difficult countries in Asia to access for any purpose, let alone to conduct private excavations at a military airfield. Kundal went anyway. Repeatedly, he navigated the bureaucratic machinery of a secretive government, building relationships with officials who were accustomed to using access as leverage. He paid fees. He waited. He returned when meetings fell through. He applied again when applications were denied. By the mid-2000s, he had built the kind of contacts that only persistent, patient presence creates. The kind that functions not on formal channels, but on personal familiarity built over years of return visits and careful relationship management. This persistence was, in retrospect, both admirable and problematic. Admirable because it required a quality of determination that most people simply do not possess. Problematic because the act of persisting through 15 years of obstacles had itself become a form of evidence in Kundal's mind. You do not spend this much effort on a fiction, but the logical relationship between the effort invested and the truth of the underlying claim is not one that holds. People spend years pursuing things that are not there. The investment does not validate the premise. It only measures the strength of the belief. Between his first trip to Burma and his breakthrough in 2012, David Kundal accumulated a collection of testimonies that would have impressed any wartime historian. Men who had served at Mingaladon came forward in response to his magazine advertisements. Flight engineers, ground crew, logistics officers. Some of them were specific. They named units, described the physical process of lowering crates into prepared trenches by crane. Some were vaguer. They had heard it from someone in their unit who had seen it. The researchers who would later examine these testimonies noted something important about their distribution. The closer a witness claimed to have been to the actual event, the less specific their details became. The most confident statements, the ones that named exact locations and exact numbers of aircraft, tended to come from men who had heard the story from someone else. The men who claimed direct participation were often less certain about the specifics. This is a pattern that cognitive scientists have documented. Confidence is not calibrated to proximity. Sometimes the most distant witness, the one who heard it third hand, carries the story with the greatest certainty, because the story they carry has been simplified and sharpened by repeated retelling until every ambiguity has been smoothed away. None of this means the witnesses were lying. It means they were human. And in the absence of documentary evidence to test the testimonies against, the human memory was the only evidence available. 16 years of gathering that evidence, 16 years of believing it. In April 2012, the newspapers of the United Kingdom ran a story that, if the journalists had paused to think about it carefully, was almost surreally improbable. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, had raised the subject of buried Spitfires during his visit to Burma in that same month, the first visit by a British head of government in nearly 60 years. Cameron had discussed the matter with the Burmese president, and the result was a formal government-to-government agreement to allow David Kundal to excavate. The British embassy in Yangon confirmed the agreement. It was described as a significant result of the diplomatic opening then underway as Myanmar began its cautious transition away from military rule. And, in a sense, it was significant, though not quite in the way the newspapers suggested. What it demonstrated was not that the Spitfires were there. What it demonstrated was that the legend had become real enough, credible enough, to be raised in a bilateral meeting between two heads of state. David Kundal had achieved something that no aviation enthusiast before him had managed. He had made a wartime legend into a matter of foreign policy. He had taken a story heard at a party in Florida in the 1980s and, through 20 years of relentless pursuit, elevated it to the level of diplomatic negotiation. The Myanmar government staged a formal contract signing ceremony in Naypyidaw, the country's new purpose-built capital. The British ambassador attended. Whatever else can be said about David Kundal, this was not a small thing. A farmer from Lincolnshire had moved the machinery of two governments in pursuit of an idea. That had never happened before. In the months between the diplomatic announcement in April 2012 and the beginning of the excavation in January 2013, the story of the Burma Spitfires achieved a kind of global critical mass. Radio networks ran features. Documentary crews were commissioned. Aviation magazines that had followed Kundal's search for years finally had a payoff to report. The excavation was actually going to happen. The Spitfires were, depending on your source, 20 in number, or 60, or even 140. That variation in those numbers should have been a warning. Claims that cannot agree on an order of magnitude are claims built on uncertain foundations. But the emotional architecture of the story was so powerful that the numerical inconsistency registered only as a minor footnote. What mattered to the journalists and their readers was the image. Brand new Spitfires, sealed in their delivery crates, resting under the red earth of Myanmar, intact after nearly 70 years. The finest fighter aircraft of the Second World War, waiting to fly again. In an era of digital archives and satellite imagery and instant information, the idea that something so large and so historically significant could simply be hidden underground was not alarming. It was wonderful. The company that would fund the expedition, Wargaming, understood this perfectly. And when they came on board as financial sponsors, they brought with them a communications operation that knew exactly how to build a story. Wargaming is the company behind World of Tanks, the massively popular online game that pits players against each other in simulated armored combat. By 2012, the company had a player base in the tens of millions. Its business was built on the appeal of historical military hardware. Real tank names, real specifications, real battles digitally reconstructed for competitive play. Its director of special projects, Tracy Spate, understood that the Burma Spitfires story was, for a company whose brand was built on historical military machines, an opportunity of remarkable alignment. The irony was not lost on everyone who heard it. A company that made its money recreating historical battles in digital form was now financing the search for a real artifact from one of the most obscure campaigns of the most documented war in history. Spate was not simply a check signer, he was also an investigator. As he engaged more deeply with the Kundal project in late 2012, he began to notice things that the enthusiasts around the story had not been weighing carefully enough. The archival evidence, the RAF records, the logistics of the claim. He commissioned historical research through contacts at major military archives, and what that research began to return was not encouraging, but the excavation was already scheduled, the government agreement was signed, the excavators were hired, the cameras were ready, and in January 2013, the team flew to Yangon. The team that arrived at Yangon International Airport in January 2013 was serious. Andy Brockman, the archaeologist who led the excavation, was a specialist in the archaeology of modern conflict. He had directed digs on Second World War sites across Britain. He knew how to read a site, how to evaluate evidence, and how to recognize when the evidence was not pointing in the expected direction. The geophysical surveys that Dr. Adam Booth and Dr. Roger Clark ran in the weeks before the main excavation were the most thorough yet conducted on the site. Ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic induction, magnetometry, the full toolkit of non-invasive perspection. The anomalies returned by the instruments were real. There was something under the ground, multiple somethings, at depths consistent with the testimonies, of dimensions consistent with packing crates. The team marked the locations. The JCB excavators moved into position. Myanmar airport officials watched from a respectful distance, and the digging began. 40 years of waiting, 20 years of searching, 130,000 pounds spent, 2 governments involved, and now, finally, the machines were in the earth. Archaeology is a discipline built on the management of expectations. The experienced archaeologist does not approach a dig with a fixed conclusion. They approach it with a hypothesis and an open willingness to be proved wrong. Andy Brockman had both. He believed the geophysical anomalies were real, and he believed they would yield something. He was less certain than the journalists camped outside the airport perimeter about what that something would be. The first cuts into the ground revealed exactly what the radar had suggested: dense, reflective material at consistent depth. The shapes, when excavated, proved to have the geometry that the instruments had mapped: long, rectangular, regular. The team stopped, documented, photographed, and then looked more carefully at what they had actually uncovered. It was metal, but not aluminium, not the riveted skin of a Spitfire fuselage, not the machined alloy of a Griffin engine. It was steel, iron alloy steel, manufactured in a grid pattern with round perforations at regular intervals. Anyone with a knowledge of Second World War airfield construction recognized it immediately. It was pierced steel planking, Marston mat. The interlocking steel sheets used by Allied air forces throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters to construct temporary runways, taxiways, and dispersal areas on unprepared ground. The pierced steel planking at Mingaladon had been buried when the airfield was upgraded after the war. It was, in the most literal sense, the infrastructure of the wartime RAF in Burma, a layer of the actual war pressed into the ground. But it was not what they had come to find. The excavation continued. A second site was opened, a third. The geophysical team extended their survey to adjacent areas of the airport. In Myitkyina, in northern Kachin State, Burmese-led surveys were conducted at a second location, mentioned in some of the veterans' testimonies. The results were consistent. At every site, the anomalies resolved into wartime construction material: steel planking, concrete, drainage infrastructure, no wooden crates, no aircraft components, no aluminium, no engines. The official report, titled "Assume Missing, Reported Buried," was published following the excavation. It was rigorous and measured in its language, as archaeological reports are trained to be. But its conclusion was unambiguous. No crated Spitfire aircraft were delivered to Mingaladon or to Myitkyina, and no such aircraft were buried at either location. Andy Brockman, in the interviews that followed, was careful with his words. He noted that the absence of evidence was not identical to the evidence of absence. Proving that something is not there is logically more demanding than proving that it is. But the absence of evidence in this case was accompanied by something more powerful than mere non-detection. It was accompanied by the archival record. The hole in the ground was empty, and the hole in the story, once opened, was the same. Parallel to the field work, Tracy Spate and his historical research team had been working in the archives. The RAF, unlike some military organizations, has always maintained meticulous records of logistics: what arrived, when, by which ship, in how many crates, and what was done with it. The records from the Burma Theater, 1945 to 1946, were in the National Archives. What those records show is specific and devastating to the legend. The RAF unit responsible for handling shipments through Rangoon docks received 37 aircraft in total across 3 transport ships between 1945 and 1946. Not 140, not 60, 37. And when the researchers examined what those aircraft were and what happened to them, the picture became clearer still. The crates that arrived at Rangoon did not contain Spitfires. Most of the consignment appears to have been re-exported in the autumn of 1946. Pat Woodward, a former RAF pilot who had flown operational missions from Burma during the final stages of the campaign, stated categorically that no burial of aircraft had taken place at Mingaladon, in his knowledge. And the logic of the military situation, once examined, made the burial scenario still less plausible. Why bury brand new aircraft rather than ship them back, or sell them to an Allied Air Force? The French and Indian Air Forces both received surplus RAF aircraft in 1945 and 1946. Disposal by transfer was the standard procedure. Burial was not a standard procedure. It was not even a documented exception. The aircraft in the testimonies, the ones that were supposed to be in the earth, had simply never been there. In 2020, Andy Brockman and Tracy Spade published the definitive account of the search and its aftermath. The book traced the myth not as an act of deliberate deception, but as an act of collective wishful memory, a process that cognitive scientists and historians of memory had documented across a wide range of wartime legends. The veterans who gave testimony to David Kundal were not lying. They were doing what human memory does under certain conditions, assembling a coherent narrative from fragments, filling gaps with what makes sense, and lending certainty to a story that, repeated enough times, begins to feel like personal recollection. The book also examined the role of the media, of the communications operation behind the expedition, and of the particular cultural power of the Spitfire as a symbol in the first decade of the 21st century, a period in which the memory of the Second World War was functioning as a stabilizing anchor in British public life. The legend had flourished in that specific cultural soil. It had given people something to believe in, and the belief had been real, even if the aircraft were not. David Kundal's response to the excavation results was not one of immediate capitulation. He maintained for some time that the search had not been conducted in the right location. He had spent 20 years and £130,000. The human capacity to revise downward an investment of that magnitude is limited. That, too, is human. And that, too, is part of the story. There is a question that the Burma Spitfire's story poses with unusual sharpness. Why do we so readily believe in buried treasures of war? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering, but it is important. Wartime generates legends at a rate that peacetime cannot match, because wartime does things with objects that peacetime does not. It creates scarcity. It creates loss. It creates the possibility of things disappearing without trace, of aircraft crashing into oceans with no witness, of ships going to the bottom with their logs unsaved. The documentary record of a war, however meticulous, always has gaps. And in those gaps, legends grow. The Spitfire was a particularly fertile host for legend because of what it represented culturally. By the 1980s and 90s, when the Burma story was circulating, the Battle of Britain had been so thoroughly woven into British national memory that the Spitfire was no longer simply an aircraft. It was a reliquary, a physical embodiment of a moment in which a small island had faced an overwhelming enemy and survived. Finding buried Spitfires would not merely be an archaeological discovery. It would be a communion with that myth. The psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades documenting how suggestion shapes memory, how a story told with enough authority and specificity can create a false recollection indistinguishable from a real one. The veterans who gave testimony to David Kundal had been young men in 1945. They had done things in the chaos of demobilization that they may not fully remember. Some had heard the burial story through their units. Some had seen trenches being dug and assumed what was being buried. The gap between assumption and certainty is not always visible from the inside. Here is the hardest, and perhaps the most important, observation about the Burma Spitfire's story. What David Kundal found, in the end, may be more historically significant than any aircraft. He found the anatomy of a wartime myth. He found, and in finding forced researchers to document, exactly how a story without archival foundation can acquire the weight of evidence over decades of retelling. The formal investigation that Wargaming's money funded, the excavation that Andy Brockman directed, and the book that Brockman and Spate wrote together, these constitute the first time in Second World War historiography that a major popular legend was subjected to the full toolkit of modern archaeology and archival research simultaneously. The result is a documented case study in how myths form, how they resist evidence, and how institutions, up to and including the governments of the United Kingdom and Myanmar, can be drawn into the orbit of a story that has no factual foundation. That is not a small thing. The methodology developed to investigate the Burma Spitfires can be applied to other wartime legends. The cognitive and cultural analysis in the Brockman-Spate book is a contribution to the history of memory and belief that extends beyond the specific question of buried aircraft in Myanmar. David Kundal did not find Spitfires, but the search for the Spitfires produced knowledge of a different and more durable kind. So, what remains of the Spitfire in the world today? Not the buried ones, not the imagined ones, not the ones sealed in waxed paper under the runways of an international airport in Southeast Asia, but the real ones, the ones that fought. Approximately 60 Spitfires remain airworthy in the world as of 2025. They are flown at air shows, maintained by specialist restorers, kept in flying condition at enormous ongoing expense by individuals and institutions for whom the aircraft represents something that no digital simulation quite captures. The sound of a Merlin engine, or a Griffin, has a frequency and a texture that photographers and filmmakers have tried for 80 years to capture adequately. Most of them will tell you that they have not quite managed it. The physical reality of the machine exceeds what reproduction can do. Many more Spitfires survive as static exhibits in the Imperial War Museum in London, in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, in museums across the United States, Canada, and continental Europe. They are the machines that were saved, some by luck, some by foresight, some by the efforts of individuals who understood, even in 1945, that these aircraft were already becoming artifacts. The Acero of the Spitfire that survived did so because someone decided it was worth preserving, which is, in a way, the same impulse that drove David Kundal for 20 years. The conviction that something of value had been buried and should be recovered. R.J. Mitchell died before he saw what his aircraft would do. He designed a machine that became a symbol of survival, and then he did not survive to see the symbol function. There is something in that asymmetry that the Burma Spitfire's story echoes without resolving. The planes that were supposed to be underground were never there. The testimony that seemed to confirm them dissolved under archival scrutiny into the normal confusion of wartime memory. The geophysical anomalies that looked so promising were the perforated steel of runways, the infrastructure of a war rather than its weapons. The Acero was there, in the ground, as it is across every battlefield of the Second World War. But it was not the Acero anyone came looking for. What remains in the end is this: a farmer from Lincolnshire who gave 20 years of his life to a story because he believed it mattered. Two governments who took that story seriously enough to make it a matter of diplomacy. A team of archaeologists and historians who dug through the documentary record to establish the truth. And a machine, the Spitfire, that still flies in 60 different examples across the world, still carrying in its elliptical wing the ghost of a designer who never saw what he had made. The steel that was found in Burma was not the steel anyone sought, but it was real. It was there, and it is still there, buried under the tarmac of an international airport, a layer of the war pressed into the earth. Not a cache, not a treasure, just the ordinary residue of an extraordinary time, waiting in the dark, as all history eventually does. Stay curious,